So welcome back everyone for the first workshop of the day. I hope you are enjoying the conference so far. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming a speaker whose work explore a fascinating and emerging area of research, which is invertebrate sentience. This subject has significant implication for invertebrate welfare and offer a deeper understanding of animal consciousness. So Andrew joined the Royal Veterinary College in London last year as a lecturer in animal cognition and welfare, a position where he is doing research on invertebrate sentience and welfare. His presentation today will explore indicators of invertebrate sentience, a complex concept that requires multiple approaches to be studied effectively. So Andrew will present for the next 30 minutes, and I encourage you to share any question in the live chat, and I'll make sure to pass them on to him during the Q&A session, which will be the 30 minutes after his presentation. So Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Catherine, for that introduction, also for inviting me to speak today. As Catherine said, I'm going to talk about invertebrate sentience. What's the sort of scientific evidence for invertebrate sentience, such as it exists? But then also, what are the ethical implications of sentience? Why do we care about sentience from the perspective of animal welfare in particular? And I'll be honest from the outset here, I have a bit of a sort of ulterior motive with this presentation. There's kind of big idea, I suppose, behind it, which is that I've sort of come to the conclusion that animal welfare science and policy are kind of fundamentally misguided. I think there's something that basically every animal welfare scientist in the world is kind of not doing quite right. And unless that sounds too horrifically arrogant that I'm saying everyone else is wrong and I'm right, I think I'm just as wrong as everyone else. I've just maybe started to be concerned about that. But in a kind of lame attempt to try and create suspense in this presentation, I'm not going to say why I think animal welfare science is fundamentally misguided until the very end. So tune in for that. All right, let's start by, I guess, thinking about animal welfare science and what animals we study. This is a graph from a paper from about 10 years ago now, Walker et al. And they looked at the mentions of different groups of animals in the sort of major animal welfare type journals. And you can see that sort of cows and pigs came out top. They got about sort of 160 or so mentions every year. Poultry got about half that, so about 70 mentions in the year. Crustaceans, so moving into the invertebrates, they only got 7 mentions. And insects weren't mentioned at all, presumably because they weren't mentioned at all in any of these journals. So that's kind of the state of animal welfare science in terms of what we study. Lots of sort of charismatic mammals, very, very little / no invertebrates. And this really matters because of the number of individual animals from each of these groups that are slaughtered. So let's think about cows to start with. Annually around the world, there are around, this is one estimate, there are around 300 million beef cattle that are slaughtered around the world. And that's a lot of animals. You know, if there are severe welfare issues going on for beef cows, then that's a lot of individual animals, 300 million. But it's not that many individuals when we compare it to, say, the number of chickens slaughtered annually. So there's about maybe 50 to 70 billion chickens being slaughtered annually. I should say that all of these estimates are pretty conservative. And all of them do vary quite a lot. So there are sort of 300 million beef cows slaughtered annually. That's a tiny number compared to the 50 billion chickens. And yet we're studying sort of these cattle at sort of twice the rate that we're studying all poultry. And so this, I think, starts to suggest that maybe animal welfare science is not focusing in particular on sort of the animals where the most individuals are. And I should say that I think this probably also applies to animal behavior more generally. But even this number of sort of chickens, for example, is dwarfed by the number of, if we think about just crustaceans, so invertebrate animals, a sort of conservative estimate might say there are kind of 250 billion crustaceans being slaughtered annually by humans. It could easily be double that. And so this dwarfs even the number of chickens. And yet, as animal welfare scientists, we're really not talking very much about these invertebrate animals. 7 mentions in animal welfare journals back in 2014 about crustaceans versus kind of 70 plus for chickens and well over 100 for cows and pigs. So I think in terms of number of individuals, animal welfare science is not allocating its research and its priorities in the right way. We might ask, well, is there a reason for that? Is there a sort of legitimate reason to not really study crustaceans very much and to study things like cows and pigs a lot more? And a lot of animal welfare scientists would say, yes, they think there is a reason. And that reason is to ask, well, does the welfare of an animal like a crustacean really matter? And I illustrate this by using what I call the parable of the pebble and the poodle. It's not really a parable, I just like alliteration. Essentially, it's asking this question. You have 2 entities here. You have a pebble and you have a poodle. do we care about the welfare of these two entities? Maybe we care about both, maybe we care about neither, maybe we care about one but not the other. In other words, if I were to sort of bring a hammer along and threaten to sort of hit the pebble and the poodle, which one would you care about? And I'm not going to labor this too much because I think the answer is pretty intuitive, and the vast majority of people would say we should care about the welfare of the poodle, of the dog, but not of the pebble. But then I guess the more interesting question is why? Why do we care about the welfare of poodles or other mammals? And why do we not care about the welfare of, say, pebbles or plants or protists or microwaves? What is the kind of ethical dividing line between these two entities? And I would say the answer to that is sentience. So sentience is the capacity to have kind of subjectively experienced positive or negative mental states. And we all have sort of sentience experiences constantly. These are colloquially known as feelings. They include everything from kind of pain to pleasure, hunger to thirst, warmth, depression, excitement, basically any sort of subjective experience which has a kind of positive or negative character. And so sentience, I think, is really important ethically. This is a very famous quote from the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. He was thinking about that question of essentially, why do we care about poodles but not pebbles? And he says the question is not, can they reason? It's not about how intelligent they are. We don't worry about human welfare based on how intelligent the person is. Nor can they talk. It's not about ability to speak. We care about the welfare of kind of babies, for example, before they can speak. The question is rather, can they suffer? So that's that kind of important ethical dividing line. We think that the poodle can suffer. We think that if I hit it with a hammer, it will feel pain in a way that we don't think about the pebble. And so that's why sentience really matters ethically from an animal welfare perspective. Increasingly, sentience also matters legally, so it matters in law. And that's because if you're drafting an animal welfare law, you need to know where to kind of draw the line. That is, which animal should you protect and which animal should you exclude from that welfare law? Now, often people think, oh, it's an animal welfare law, you protect all animals. That's actually not the case. So if I sort of scratch my face, for example, I will probably kill hundreds of microscopic mites. And I had a shower this morning. So what that means is that basically huge numbers of microscopic animals with very, very simple nervous systems will be killed by just about anything that you do. And so we probably want to draft an animal welfare law that doesn't include those kind of animals to make our lives sort of possible to live. So sentience does matter legally because we need to know where to draw the line when it comes to animal welfare legislation. And increasingly over the last 30 years or so, a lot of countries and regions have been recognizing animals as sentient beings. So in the USA, for example, certain states like Oregon recognize animals as sentient beings. Tanzania was one of the first countries to do it in 2008. In Canada, in Quebec, in New Zealand, in a revision of their Animal Welfare Act in 2015, and then most recently here in the UK, so with the Animal Welfare Sentience Act, which passed in 2022. And this essentially recognises animals in the UK as sentient beings. But this, of course, raises the question of, well, which animals are sentient? Where should we draw that line? Which animals should we recognise as sentient and include in this Sentience Act? And which animals should we not? Which animals should we say, they're like microscopic mites, they're like pebbles, they should be outside the scope of this legislation. Now, originally, the kind of government's response to this was to basically say that in this act, animal means any vertebrate other than Homo sapiens. So only vertebrate animals. So if we're thinking about a sort of tree of life, it's just this stuff here in the sort of purple circle, only the kind of mammals and the birds and the reptiles, the amphibians and the fishes. But that raises a kind of obvious question when you look at a tree of life of, well, are any of these invertebrate animals, the sort of vast bulk of life on Earth, are any of them sentient? Should we be including any of those in this kind of legislation and protecting them and their welfare? This is, I should emphasize, not an easy question to answer. Which animals are sentient is really not an easy question to answer. And that's because studying sentience is just really, really difficult in a scientific way. And it's difficult because of what features sentience has. So sentience is inherently private and it's inherently subjective. Only you can feel your own feelings. You might be able to tell other people and other people might be able to empathize with your own feelings, but only you have direct access to your sentient experience. So sentience is private and sentience is subjective. Science, on the other hand, is very good at studying phenomena that are observable and objective. So, for example, I was kind of looking at the movement of the planets in the sky if I was an astronomer. By the way, why didn't they call astronomers scientists? Not important. Science is very good at studying observable, objective phenomena. So if I'm looking at the sort of movements of planets in the sky, I can note down where the planet is. I can use that to determine where the planet's moving, and I can use that to predict where the planet's going to go in the future. So science is very good at studying that kind of observable objective phenomenon. But this obviously is completely the opposite of sentience, which is private and it's subjective. So how can science kind of study this quality sentience, which is really not very scientific or can't be measured particularly in a scientific way? So this is the kind of fundamental challenge of studying sentience. It's private and it's subjective. It's not really observable and it's not objective, which is what science is very good at studying. Now, we humans can kind of get around this, I suppose, by describing our feelings using language. We can talk, but this is obviously impossible for other animals. I tend to illustrate this with the example of nociception versus pain, which is one that comes up an awful lot in this field. So these are kind of two related concepts. Nociception is just the processing of noxious stimuli by a nervous system. Pain then is associated with nociception, so it's very related, but it's the kind of unpleasant feeling associated with that processing. And so pain is the sentient experience, pain is the feeling. Nociception is not necessarily sentient. So nociceptive reflexes do not require pain. So let's illustrate this with a very simple diagram of the human nervous system. So this person is touching a needle, so they're putting their finger on a needle, and then kind of very simply sort of two separate but related things happen. So thing one is that a signal is transmitted up the arm, a nerve signal. It goes up to the spinal cord, and then from there it goes to the bicep, and that causes the arm to be withdrawn. So you touch a needle, nervous signal goes up to the spinal cord, goes back to the bicep, and your arm is withdrawn. And that's a sort of nociceptive withdrawal reflex. The sort of second related thing that happens is that a signal is also sent up to the brain, and it's in the brain that pain is generated. So you kind of subjectively feel the pain in your finger, but it's generated in the brain. So why am I talking about this? Well, if we're thinking about which animals are sentient, we can't just look at whether they say withdraw from injury, because that could be a simple nociceptive reflex. It doesn't necessarily tell us that that animal feels pain. So again, this just illustrates the difficulty of actually studying this quality that we call sentience. It's really hard to study scientifically, and we can't just look for kind of simple withdrawal reflexes to tell us that an animal might feel pain. So I guess one of the take-home messages from this workshop is to forget certainty in this realm. I don't think we're at a point now when it comes to scientifically studying sentience where we can say for sure that this animal or that animal is sentient. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think the science has progressed to that point. However, this raises the question of, well, how do we address the ethical importance of sentience, it being that kind of ethically important dividing line between pebble and poodle, while still acknowledging scientific uncertainty? In other words, how do we kind of stay being good scientists when we're studying sentience, whilst also being kind of good citizens and trying to protect animals that are sentient? How do we kind of square that circle? And for me, at least, I think a good way of doing that is to adopt what's known as the precautionary principle. And this basically says that in the face of serious welfare risks, we should treat animals as if they are sentient, even in the absence of certainty. So we should take a precautionary approach to animal sentience. If there's really severe welfare risks that are involved, we should maybe treat animals as if they're sentient, even though it's not necessarily scientifically possible to say that for sure. And this is a very common approach used in policymaking. So with drink driving, for example, if you drink alcohol and get behind the wheel of a car, it's not certain that you'll hit someone, but the probability is raised. So we take a kind of precautionary approach to banning drink driving based on the increased likelihood of risk. So essentially we're saying, let's do that same thing for animals in the face of these really severe welfare risks. Even if we can't say for certain they're sentient, that's kind of too high an evidential bar. However, I think it's important to note that precautionary reasoning doesn't mean anything goes. It doesn't mean we should protect all pebbles, all microscopic mites, all plants, all protists, all microwaves. I think we do need to have some evidence that the animal is plausibly sentient. Otherwise, our laws will be completely unenactable. We won't be able to do literally anything in the world. And so we do need, I think, some evidence that an animal is sentient before we start taking precautionary reasoning into account. So when we're trying to be precautionary, that doesn't mean we're saying that everything, absolutely everything is sentient. I think it's saying if there's lines of evidence that plausibly suggest sentience, then we should start to be concerned about that animal's welfare, even in the absence of certainty. So it's sort of a balancing act between these two imperatives. One, protect possibly sentient animals. Two, make sure that, say, legislation is actually workable. So, okay, let's come back to invertebrates. Are they plausibly sentient? Do we have enough evidence to say that we should take a precautionary approach to their welfare? This is a question that my colleagues and I were faced with a few years ago when the UK government asked us to, when they were drafting the Sentience Act, and they were only originally including vertebrates, they asked us to review the evidence for sentience in some invertebrate animals, in particular cephalopod mollusks, so octopus, squid, and cuttlefish, and decapod crustaceans, so kind of lobsters and crabs and shrimp. If you don't like yourself very much, you can read that 50,000 word report at this link. We also did a journal paper on it and a magazine article as well, which is much shorter. But we essentially sort of evaluated the evidence for sentience in decapods and cephalopods. And to do that, we came up with 8 criteria for sentience that covered both neurobiological aspects of the animal's nervous system and also behavioral evidence for sentience, asking, well, is the animal responding as though by sort of nociceptive reflex, or is there maybe something more complex going on? I'm not going to go through each of the 8 criteria now, but a few points to make on them. Firstly, like I say, they cover both the animal's nervous system and its behavior. Second is that none kind of proves or disproves sentience. And even if the animal satisfies all 8, that doesn't mean it is definitely sentient. We're talking about a sort of probability raising or lowering list of criteria here. We're not offering certainty. It's about the probability, the plausibility, I think, of sentience in these animals. And so the more criteria that an animal fulfills, the more of these 8 criteria the animal satisfies, I think the more likely sentience becomes, and the more concerned we should become about that particular animal's welfare. And we might sort of introduce some kind of threshold. Like, for example, we might say that if an animal satisfies at least 5 criteria, that's quite strong evidence for sentience, at least where policymakers are concerned, at least when it comes to taking that kind of precautionary approach. So these are our 8 criteria for sentience. I realize that's sort of quite abstract, but I'm now going to illustrate it with one example of a study in invertebrates, which I think is quite convincing. So this was a study by Robin Crook on octopus, and it was a condition-place preference paradigm. So what you had is that the octopuses were given an option between 2 chambers. Here, that's a stripy chamber and a spotty chamber. And they initially showed a preference, and in this diagram, they showed an initial preference for the stripy chamber. However, if they received a noxious stimulus in the stripy chamber, so an injection of acid in the tentacle, they would actually switch their preference, and they would avoid that initial preferred chamber and go instead to the spotty chamber. So they would switch their preference to the dispreferred chamber. So this starts to potentially be a small probability raising piece of evidence for pain in octopuses. It's not proving it, I think, but it does slightly raise the probability. The cool thing about this study, though, is that they did a lot more than that. And so what they also did was looked at the effect of analgesics. So in this third treatment, not only were they given the noxious stimulation in the initially preferred chamber, so that stripy chamber, they were also given it in the dispreferred chamber, so the spotty chamber. But in the spotty chamber, they were also given an analgesic. And it turns out that they still showed that preference for the spotty chamber. So what this suggests is that potentially the analgesic is working in octopuses. So the octopuses are showing a response to an analgesic that's at least consistent with it reducing the experience of pain. So not only do they learn to avoid areas where they've received noxious stimulation, but they also learn to prefer areas where they've received noxious stimulation, but also an analgesic, a painkiller. There are also some interesting behavioral results, so I think these were less robust. So in that kind of initial control condition with just a neutral stimulus, the octopuses paid no attention to the tentacle. However, in the noxious stimulus treatment, they were showing kind of grooming, removal of flakes of skin, and sort of concealing the tentacle up beneath their body. And then again, when the analgesic was provided, those behavioral responses were abolished. So again, this suggests that potentially the analgesic is working in octopuses. There was also some nerve recordings. So this is in the brachial connective, which is the nerve basically between the tentacles and the central brain in octopuses. You can see there's minimal activity, both in the control condition and when the analgesic was applied, but there was sort of really strong nervous system activity in the noxious stimulus treatment. So I think this one study sort of on its own potentially satisfies a number of our 8 criteria. So it shows criterion 3, neural connections between the nociceptors and the brain. In this case, that's the brachial connective. It shows really obvious responses, I think, to an analgesic based on those condition-place preference results. Potentially shows some kind of flexible self-protective behavior of the tentacles. There's some evidence from associative learning, which I think is relevant in terms of learning sort of to avoid a chamber that was initially preferred. And finally, it shows that specifically the octopuses kind of value analgesics when injured through those condition-place preference results again. So I think this one study provides actually several potential lines of evidence for at least a sort of pain experience in octopuses. And we can bring lots of studies like this together and compile them to think about sort of the overall evidential picture. So in this table down the side, we have the different types of cephalopods, so octopuses, cuttlefish, squid, and then nautilus. And then along the top of the table, we have those 8 criteria, so criterion 1, 2, up to 8. And then the boxes basically show how high our confidence is that that group of animals satisfies that criterion. And so just to zoom in on octopuses now, you can see that they satisfy 7 of the 8 criteria with either high or very high confidence. Lots of green boxes there. And this is, I think, getting to be pretty strong evidence for sentience, at least when it comes to policymaking. I think we're starting to think, yes, we should definitely be taking a precautionary approach to sentience in octopuses. We should be considering their welfare. There is, I think, enough evidence to start taking that precautionary approach for octopuses. All right, what about decapod crustaceans? This is another study that I was not involved in, sadly, because it was published in Science. And this was looking at kind of anxiety, if you like state in crayfish. So in this study, the crayfish were put in a light maze. So it was a plus-shaped maze, 4 arms. 2 of the arms were dark and the other 2 were illuminated. And if the crayfish were just sort of put into this plus maze and left to wander around as they liked, they basically walked evenly into each of the 4 arms. So they sort of spent about as much time in the light arms as they did in the dark arms. However, if they were stressed out, so if an electric field was applied, they tended to focus very much solely on the dark arms. So they would sort of stay only in those dark arms if they were stressed. And this makes sense ecologically, because in the wild crayfish, if they say, for example, sense predators, they will tend to go into dark shelters. But the authors of this study thought, well, potentially this could be a kind of analog of anxiety in humans that's leading to this kind of response. And so they tried administering a human anti-anxiety drug, so diazepam. What they found was that if they stressed the crayfish and gave them diazepam, this anti-anxiety drug, it basically abolished this behavioral response. So again, this is not definitely crayfish experience anxiety, and it's certainly not definitely crayfish experience anxiety like humans, but it is saying potentially that this is a line of evidence that crayfish might have some sort of equivalent neurobiological mechanisms. So I think we can say here that this study seems to satisfy this criterion, that they're showing a sort of response to an anxiolytic drug that's at least consistent with sentience in crayfish. So here's the overall kind of evidential picture for decapod crustaceans. Again, you have sort of different types of decapods down the side of this table, the 8 criteria along the top, and then how confident we are that each of those groups satisfy each of those criteria. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of groups of crustaceans. The first is the true crabs, the brachyurans. You can see that they satisfy at least 5 of the criteria. I think that's reasonably strong evidence for sentience. It's not absolutely conclusive, but it's reasonably strong. We can contrast this with the poor Penaeid shrimps down at the bottom here. They only satisfy 1 criterion, which is the presence of nociceptors, and even that is, I think, pretty circumstantial. A takeaway from that might be to say, well, okay, Penaeid shrimps then almost definitely are not sentient. They're probably just responding to everything by nociceptive reflex. I personally think that would be a bad takeaway from this table, because it doesn't distinguish between if the animal has been tested on that criterion and found not to meet it, in which case it would potentially be evidence against sentience in that group, or if the research simply hasn't been done. So in the case of Penaeid shrimps, it's basically the case that pretty much nobody has tried testing these other 7 criteria. We don't know how many criteria they would actually satisfy if there were robust and rigorous science done on all 8. So we're in a situation of real uncertainty, and I think that raises the question for an animal like a Penaeid shrimp, where kind of sentience research hasn't been done, do we protect them based on evidence from related species like true crabs, where much more research has been done, and therefore there's a much stronger evidential picture? So this really raises the question, I think, of how do we deal with understudied groups of animals? And my personal view on this is to say that, well, rather than having laws that protect only the really well-studied species, it's better to aim for broad coverage in high-level legislation. And by the way, we do this for vertebrates all the time. So to my knowledge, for example, beavers have never been studied when it comes to sentience. However, based on research from lab rodents, for example, we extrapolate and we say that probably if we were to look in beavers, there'll be lots of evidence. It's simply that no one's looked. And so we protect beavers as well as lab rodents, at least in the UK. However, I think this also needs to be backed up with enforceable best practice guidance specific to the needs of commercially or scientifically important species. So we do need to take into account that different species differ and they have different welfare needs. But in high-level legislation, I think we should, broadly speaking, extrapolate from well-studied species to their closely related but understudied relatives. And so this led to the sort of overall recommendation in our report that we thought that all cephalopod mollusks and all decapod crustaceans should be regarded as sentient for the purposes of animal welfare law. That's not to say that all of them have fantastically strong evidence for sentience, but we thought there was enough evidence in some key species that actually we should take a precautionary approach and protect all of them. This faced some resistance in the UK Parliament. So this is Lord Moylan, a Conservative peer in the House of Lords. He said in a debate on this, who are the scientists in whom the government are placing such faith for the scientific basis of animal sentience that they claim to exist? Where do they gather? Which respectable journals do they publish in? Who is this cadre of leading animal sentience scientists? Lord Moylan was not impressed. And of course, is a great expert in animal sentience, given his long history in merchant banking. I shouldn't be sassy. Fortunately, most members of Parliament disagreed with Lord Moylan, and actually, as a result of this work, the UK government amended the Animal Sentience Bill. So rather than just any vertebrate other than Homo sapiens being recognised as sentient, they did recognise any cephalopod mollusk and any decapod crustacean. So at least the start of a win, I think, particularly for the decapods, which weren't previously recognised under UK animal welfare law. This understandably received quite a lot of media coverage, including from around the world, which was nice to see. But I think there's unfinished business here. And one of the big pieces of unfinished business is, how about insects? So insects are the sort of largest invertebrate group. Why didn't we evaluate evidence for sentience in insects in this big report? And the simple answer was that DEFRA didn't ask us to. They only wanted us to evaluate evidence in decapods and cephalopods. But once the report was published, we basically applied the same methodology to insects, and we published this separately. So we said that if we were to have been asked, what's the evidence for sentience in insects? Here's the review of the evidence, and here's what we would have said. Again, you can read the review here or a magazine article based on it. Here's a summary table basically showing the results from some large groups of insects, so the flies, the dipterans, the hymenopterans, so bees, wasps, and ants, and the lepidopterans, so butterflies and moths. And you can see that, again, the evidential picture is mixed. So it's not the case that we've got massively strong evidence for sentience in these groups, although I think, for example, flies in the adult form satisfying at least 5 criteria. That's starting to get into, I think, the realm of quite strong evidence. But what is, I think, worth noting here is that where we have these very low confidence for a number of criteria, again, it's not that these animals have been rigorously tested and found to not satisfy these criteria. It's simply that the work hasn't been done. So people haven't actually done the research to look at whether these animals satisfy these criteria. So I guess for an audience of kind of animal behavior researchers, this is really something where there are a lot of evidence gaps that I think it's important for us to try and study in going forwards. Just to give one example study, this was led by Matilda Gibbons, although I was a little bit involved. This was looking for evidence of motivational trade-offs in bees. So the idea here was that if animals are responding solely by nociceptive reflexes, then they won't be able to trade off competing motivations. So that might be an indication of sentience. So this is the lab setup. You can see in this diagram here at the bottom, there's the nest box where the bees lived. You then had a sort of central arena which had these 4 different colored feeders, and you can see a sort of zoomed in version of the pink feeder here. So 2 of these feeders were pink and 2 were yellow, and basically the bees had to walk onto the feeders to drink sucrose from them. But the bottom of those feeders could have a heat pattern. So the 2 motivations that the bees were trading off here were firstly to avoid 50-degree heat. If we turned on the heat pads, they went to 50 degrees, which is a kind of aversive heat for bees. So that was motivation 1. But the second motivation was to consume high concentration sugar solution. So we could create this trade-off by having higher concentration sugar solution at the heated feeders than at the alternative unheated feeders. And again, these were marked by either being pink or being yellow. So in this example, the yellow feeders had 40% sugar solution, so really sweet sugar solution. Bees go absolutely crazy for this. But they had 50-degree heat. So the bees had to walk onto these really aversive heat pads in order to get that very high concentration of sugar solution. Whereas the pink feeders could have either 10, 20, 30, or 40% sugar solution and no heat. So this varied between bees. Some bees had a really big differential between the heated and unheated feeders. So 10% sucrose, very low percent sucrose at the unheated feeders, and then 40% of the heated feeders, so much better. Other bees had 40% at each. And then we basically looked at, does the sort of the response to the heat change based on that differential of sweetness of sugar solution? So here are the results from that study. I guess, so along the x-axis here, along the bottom, we have the sugar concentration at the pink feeders. So those unheated feeders, was it 10%, so much lower than the heated feeders, or was it 40%, so the same? And then at the y-axis, we have the proportion of feeds at those yellow heated feeders. So how often are the bees feeding at those yellow feeders? And the first takeaway from this graph is to say that, unsurprisingly, as you increase the concentration at the pink feeders, it reduces the number of feeds at the yellow feeders. So that once you have kind of all the feeders having 40% sucrose, you have the bees sort of going to both of them roughly equally. Whereas if you have much, much higher sugar concentration at the heated feeders, then bees will mostly go to those. What you can also see here, though, is evidence of a motivational trade-off. So the blue line here is when the yellow feeders were unheated, and the red line is when the yellow feeders were heated. And you see there's this sort of small but significant difference between the groups. So what this is telling us is that the bees' avoidance of heat, the fact they're avoiding heat, is modulated by the different concentration of sugar solution. So bees are trading off how to get the best sugar solution versus their motivation to avoid heat. So again, this satisfies, I think, several of our criteria potentially. One of those is integrative brain regions, because clearly the bees are integrating this different sensory information, the sugar consumption against the sensation of heat. I think they quite clearly show these motivational trade-offs, and they're also showing associative learning. And I'll get onto why they're showing that in a moment. One thing to say, and I guess one criticism of this research, is that actually motivational trade-offs are demonstrated in some very simple animals. So this is C. elegans. It has, I think, 302 nerve cells. It's in its entire nervous system, at least in the hermaphrodite form. And in this study, Gosh et al., they basically looked at what you might consider a motivational trade-off in C. elegans. So here you have a C. elegans. They had a food odor, which was, I think, diacetyl. And to get to the food odor, the C. elegans had to cross a sort of hyperosmotic barrier. And the question was, well, are the C. elegans likely to cross that hyperosmotic barrier and risk desiccation if they're, if you like, hungry, so if they're more food deprived? And the answer is yes. So C. elegans does tolerate that threat of desiccation more if it's, if you like, hungry, if it's food deprived. So they're more likely to cross that hyperosmotic barrier to that food odor if they're food deprived. And interestingly, this motivational trade-off is mediated by just a single interneuron, so about as simple a neural mechanism as you can possibly get. So I guess you can reasonably ask a question here: what does this mean for motivational trade-offs as evidence for sentience? They've often been taken as a real gold standard for evidence for sentience. Is that really the case? This evidence from C. elegans, I think, maybe starts to raise a question in that regard. What I would say in our motivational trade-off study is that it went beyond what previous research had done, in that it wasn't just that the bees were using kind of direct sensory inputs to make a decision. So it wasn't that they were directly comparing the taste of the sugar against the feeling of the heat. Instead, they were making the decision actually before they landed on the feeders based on the color of those chips. So they were learning the association between sweetness of sugar, so how much sugar they got, and the aversive heat. So based on these kind of learned, you might call them representations, they were making that trade-off. And I think we lack any evidence in, say, a very simple organism like C. elegans that this can be done in a very simple way. So it's possible that this more complex form of a trade-off maybe does require sentience, or is more likely to require sentience. And actually another evidence gap, I think, in animal sentience research is more back translation to human work. It'd be wonderful to know whether in humans, these more complex motivational trade-offs actually do require conscious experience, whereas the simpler ones don't. I think that would start to potentially strengthen this case in bees. For now, we don't really know, but I certainly think this is stronger evidence for sentience than the work on C. elegans. I've been talking quite a lot about evidence for sentience in invertebrates. There is a small amount of potential negative evidence, so evidence against sentience in invertebrates. So for example, this study, Greening et al., basically asked whether, it basically gave injured and uninjured honeybees feeders containing either an analgesic, so morphine, or no morphine, so a control. And so this was asking whether honeybees are capable of analgesic self-administration. Were they more likely to imbibe the morphine if they were injured versus if they weren't? And here are the results of that study. So along the bottom here, you have whether the M signifies here whether they were given the morphine feeders, and then the C indicates control versus the I is injured. And so what you would expect here is that if the bees were self-administering morphine, that the morphine injured group would consume much more of the feeder solution than the morphine control group. And then the other two boxes here are just for a sucrose control. What you can see pretty obviously here is that those first two kind of morphine boxes do not significantly differ. And so we might sort of assume from that that no, bees cannot self-administer morphine when they're injured. They don't seem to show any specialist, any increased consumption of morphine when they're injured versus when they're not. And so this potentially is sort of evidence against bees satisfying our criterion 8, that the animal is valuing an analgesic when it's injured. However, my personal view is that this study highlights the importance of really sound experimental design. So if we're running a self-administration study, I think we need to bear in mind that to self-administer analgesics, the injured animal has to essentially know two things. It has to know, number one, what's the sort of operant behavioral response necessary to administer the drug. So in this case, it's got sort of two feeders. It has to know that one of those feeders dispenses morphine and the other one doesn't. And then the second thing that the animal has to know is the drug's analgesic effect. So when these authors found that they didn't find a significant difference between the injured and the uninjured bees, they sort of like concluded that the bees did not know the drug's analgesic effect. In other words, they weren't able to self-administer morphine. I think it's perfectly plausible that actually the bees didn't satisfy criterion one, the behavioral response necessary to administer the drug. The reason for that is that the morphine and control feeders were presented simultaneously. So bees had the two feeder options, morphine and control. Now, if morphine's analgesic effects are not immediate, and if the bees weren't using the morphine feeder purely by chance when the effect kicked in, then I think we can reasonably ask, well, would the bees have learned to associate the drug's effect with the morphine feeder? In other words, would they know the behavioral response necessary to administer the morphine? Also, insects don't have opioid receptors, so morphine was an interesting choice of analgesic for them. So personally, I don't think this is particularly strong evidence against sentience in invertebrates, although it's worth noting as one of the few studies that potentially suggest they can't satisfy one of our criteria. So, okay, which animals are sentient? We started out with just the vertebrates, but which others? And again, I don't think we can deal in certainty here, but I think we might talk plausibly about, for example, the cephalopod mollusks being sentient. Certainly octopuses, I think, show a lot of good evidence for sentience, at least enough that we should be taking them into account when we're talking about animal welfare. Potentially as well, the decapod crustaceans, particularly the true crabs. There's I think some plausible evidence for sentience there. And finally, and then most controversially, at least in a UK context, the insects as well, at least some insects, because insects are such a large and diverse group of animals. This is, I guess, sort of maybe my current view on where we should be applying the precautionary principle and which animals we should be thinking about the welfare of. There are others who disagree. So there is another side to this argument of academics who think that there isn't particularly strong evidence for sentience in any invertebrates. If you're interested in that debate, we actually published our criteria in the journal Animal Sentience. And the reason that we did that is that it has open commentary. So lots of researchers could respond to our initial article and comment on our criteria. Some were positive, some were not. So if you're interested in that debate, when we posted the article, you can see we had lots of responses, and we had lots more responses. Then we had even more responses. So again, if you're interested in this debate, there's lots of fantastic responses there to the sort of stuff that I've been saying. That being said, and whilst there are those who are more skeptical than me, I think, about invertebrate sentience, I do think that we're starting to approach something of a tentative consensus in this field, certainly compared to where we were at 10 years ago. I think that was crystallized in the so-called New York Declaration on Consciousness that was published earlier this year. And this basically had three prongs. Prong number one was that the signatories argued that there is strong scientific support for attributions of conscious experience to other mammals and to birds. And I don't think that's particularly surprising. More relevantly, the second was to say that empirical evidence indicates at least a realistic possibility of conscious experience in all vertebrates and this is the important part, many invertebrates, including at minimum cephalopods, decapods, and insects. And then finally, it was to say that when there is a realistic possibility of conscious experience in an animal, we should consider and respond to welfare risks. So taking that precautionary approach, I think at least to cephalopods, decapods, and insects, and at least thinking about their welfare. And this New York Declaration on Consciousness, it's, I think, got currently about 480 signatories, all of whom have some kind of relevant experience to this field. So lots of neuroscientists, animal behavior researchers, animal welfare scientists, animal ethicists, philosophers of mind. Like I said, I think there's a kind of growing consensus that although it's not certain that any invertebrates are sentient, that maybe we should start taking into account their welfare. And that's really important because there are, I think, some pretty serious welfare issues that apply to invertebrates, in particular, thinking about invertebrate farming, so animals like certain species of insects and octopuses are farmed, or in the case of octopuses, sort of potentially farmed. That to me raises lots of potential welfare issues. The first is just a lack of welfare indicators for these animals and a lack of welfare research. I realize I've got kind of a conflict of interest here as a welfare researcher who studies invertebrates, but really we don't have kind of good welfare indicators for these animals. Megan Barrett has done some fantastic work on on farmed insect welfare, but in that she basically, it's a literature review, so she's basically relied on mortality as her welfare indicator, because we don't really have any good validated welfare indicators that might apply on farms. So we just lack that body of welfare research that has been built up over the last 50 years or so for conventional livestock. So that's a huge issue, just our lack of knowledge about these animals' welfare. Stocking density is an issue for all of these animals, for farmed octopuses, for certain species of farmed insects, and for farmed shrimp. Often they're kept at very high stocking densities, and that can lead to really high levels of aggression, and in some species, high levels of cannibalism as well. And then potentially inhumane slaughter is also an issue. There hasn't been that much work done on up to this point on humane slaughter in invertebrates. This is a study from Fregen and Bickmeyer looking at nervous system activity in lobsters after being dropped in boiling water. Sometimes you hear people say that at least it's a quick death. I think this study puts paid to that. So it showed that nervous system activity continues for 2 to 3 minutes in lobsters after they're being dropped in water. But various other slaughter methods for invertebrates, often involving sort of extreme heat or extreme cold, are also kind of quite slow, quite lingering. I think would not be considered humane if these animals are indeed sentient. So invertebrate farming has received a lot of attention when it comes to animal welfare. I think a final thing which I would sort of raise as another welfare issue, which is getting next to no attention, is pesticides, insecticides. If you apply sort of insecticides to a field, you will kill huge numbers of particularly insects, both the target species that you're aiming for, but also a lot of other insects as well, some of which actually are doing very positive roles in the ecosystem. Now, this very often is not quick. Some of these insecticides take typically days, sometimes up to a week to actually kill the animal. You have various modes of action for doing that. But by and large, I think that if these animals are capable of experiencing pain, pretty much none of those mechanisms would probably be considered particularly humane. So I think this is a huge welfare issue, which really no one's paying attention to. So on that note, let's sort of come back to this graph that I presented at the start, which is how many are slaughtered. And this quite scary graph about sort of the number of crustaceans versus the number of terrestrial animals. Again, if we think that these animals like crustaceans are plausibly sentient, then more of them are slaughtered every year than the sum total of all conventional livestock. All the cows and all the pigs and all the chickens, all of them put together, don't come to the number of farmed crustaceans. And that problem is even more acute when we think about, say, farmed insects. An estimate from Lizzie Rowe from a few years ago suggested that 1.2 trillion individual farmed insects are slaughtered every year. 1.2 trillion. I think that's a 1 and like 15 zeros. Just huge, maybe 12. I'll do the maths later. Huge number of individual animals being slaughtered in insect farms. And that's basically simply because it takes an awful lot of kind of black soldier fly larvae to create the protein content of one cow. So even though we get much more meat from, say, beef cattle, the number of individual insects being farmed is way bigger. And this isn't even sort of the scariest slide I have, because I think the scariest slide I have is when you look at the number of insects killed by pesticides every year, which is estimated at a quadrillion. I don't even know how many zeros that is, but it's a huge number. It turns even the number of farmed insects killed annually into just a line. Huge numbers of animals, potentially taking sort of days or up to a week to die, in ways that, again, if they are sentient, if they do experience pain, I think is very unlikely to be humane. So I promised at the beginning of this presentation that it had a sort of big idea, that I thought that animal welfare science and policy were fundamentally misguided. And this is why. Because I think that if our aim is to minimize animal suffering, we should really all be thinking about invertebrates. We shouldn't be focusing on conventional livestock. We shouldn't be focusing on these animals where we've had sort of 50 years of good welfare research being done. We should really switch the field's focus to invertebrates. And perhaps most controversially, in particular, maybe we should be developing more humane pesticides, because in terms of number of individual animals, number of potentially sentient individual animals, this is a bigger welfare issue than really anything in the world. Just huge numbers of individual animals that no one, myself included, is working on. So again, fantastic to talk to so many early career researchers in animal behavior. There's so much that I think that can be usefully done in this sphere. We really are just beginning. So please, if you're interested, do consider sort of going into it and working on it if you're not already. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you to my sort of institutions and my funders, and thank you to ABL for inviting me. Thank you. And I would welcome any questions, of course.
So thank you, Andrew. I think that was a really interesting talk, and based by the number of questions we have in the chat, I think the audience really appreciated that as well. And so yeah, I'm going to start reading The first question by David. So David says, do you think that attitudes to insect welfare are shaped by the negative perception of them, generally that people seem to develop as they get older?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it probably depends on the insects to some extent. So Catherine and I both work on bees. And if you're talking about kind of insect welfare and evidence for insect sentience, bees are a fantastic ambassador animal because people seem to love bees, and likewise with kind of butterflies and moths and other things that are generally considered cute. Whereas if you're talking about, say, mealworms or black soldier fly larvae, often there's perhaps a bit more of a perception that they're yucky. I think there's another way that's perhaps less talked about, which also is linked to this, which also harms particularly farmed insect welfare. And that is that I think the insect farming industry are very concerned about the kind of yuck factor of eating insects, that consumers tend to find the sort of idea, at least in Western countries, kind of gross. And the industry are very concerned about that. And I think that takes up a lot of their bandwidth. And so I think at least some in the industry are concerned that if they also bring this sort of animal welfare issue in, and they also try and address that it will kill what's currently an industry that's very early stages. So I think that also has a detrimental impact in terms of industry thinking about welfare. But yeah, it depends on the insect. And I think there's very different likelihoods of sentience in different insects and so on. But yes, I do think that people's perceptions are shaped by the fact that some people, not me, but some people think some insects are kind of gross.
So then we have a question by Luke Duncan. I think it's related to the associative learning part. So he says, playing devil's advocate, does associative learning necessarily indicate sentience? Individual cells can display associative learning behavior.
Yeah, that's a great question. No, associative learning on its own does not indicate sentience, I don't think. So there's the way that cells do it, I suppose, is a different mechanism to the way that, at least to my knowledge, that other organisms do it. But there are, I think, lots of obviously non-sentient systems that can display associative learning. So, for example, if people's spinal cord is severed, they can display sort of fairly simple classical conditioning below the point of the spinal cord, despite having kind of no sentient experience that we know of. So, yes, we do know of obvious cases where animals seem to display simple forms of associative learning without being sentient. That being said, that criterion, I think, is much more about types of associative learning that potentially are linked to sentience in humans. This is probably something actually that Catherine knows far more about than me, because she's done a lot of fantastic work on things like trace conditioning. But I think there are forms of learning that in humans seem to only be possible when we're consciously aware of, say, the stimuli or the association. And that's the kind of thing that I think we're looking at in animals. Catherine, I don't know whether you do want to add anything about your work.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think you said it during the talk, but sentience is so complex that you cannot do one experiment and say, okay, they are sentient. You need a lot of different approaches, protocols, and then little by little you build kind of the knowledge, and then you can be more sure if the animal is sentient or not. But yeah, for sure, associative learning by itself doesn't necessarily mean sentience, but there is other form of associative learning that are a bit more complex and could be a good indicator. So then we have a question by Ryan Thomas. So insect protein is proposed as an ethical and sustainable alternative to conventional animal proteins. What do you think the implications are for this? Should we find evidence of sentience in this group? You covered it a little bit at the end of your talk already.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that insect farming is fascinating because when I sort of talk to producers and people involved in the industry, I think their motives are very, very good, generally speaking. Obviously, there's sort of, to some extent, there's a profit motive, but I think often people are doing it because they see real benefits in terms of potentially you can have a sort of food system where you use waste products to feed insects, and then if we can eat the insects, then it's much less sort of carbon emissions than conventional livestock farming. So it can potentially be a really sort of sustainable way of farming, potentially, that uses much less water, much less greenhouse gases, much less land, etc. However, there is this sort of animal welfare concern, which is that it takes a hell of a lot of kind of mealworms or black soldier fly larvae to create the protein content of one cow. And so if there are any welfare issues within that farming system, they're going to be hugely magnified because there's way more individual animals that are potentially, if they are sentient, suffering. So, and also we've had kind of, I think, 50 years of research on animal welfare in conventional livestock. And so we know an awful lot about sort of what conditions are best to keep them in, what their husbandry should look like. And also just simple stuff like if their welfare is poor, how can we tell? We basically have next to none of that for invertebrates, particularly for insects. And so we need to build that body of what does good welfare even look like for an insect and which systems kind of provide that. We need to build that before I think we can really ensure that the industry is meeting it. So I do think there are really serious animal welfare issues in the insect farming industry. At the same time, I realize that animal welfare is not the only concern and that potentially there are sustainability benefits, although they're contested. I'm not the person to ask about that.
Yeah, I also related to that. I had a question, but it's also the same thing that often in animal farming, it's insect at the larval stage, right? And we really have like zero evidence of cognitive indicator or physiological indicator of sentience at that stage in insects.
Yeah, just on that point, when we were doing our big review on insects for precisely that reason, we looked at the larval stages and the different instars as well as the adult forms. And actually, I was surprised that obviously the evidence isn't nearly as strong in, say, fly larvae, but they can do more stuff than maybe one might expect. So, for example, there's sort of simple forms of associative learning that are possible in fly larvae. I think, we don't have evidence of more complex forms of associative learning, although it's very difficult to design an experiment to test that in animals with quite limited mobility. But I don't think I would easily rule out sentience before pupation in insects. I think that is a concern.
There is a need for more research for sure.
Absolutely.
So then we have another question by Luke. Is there evidence of sentience in spiders? Jumping spiders, for example, display complex learning and problem solving. Have they been the focus of sentience research?
Yeah, jumping spiders are absolutely fascinating as invertebrates go. There's sort of evidence of kind of them doing kind of route planning, for example, type stuff. I was not involved in any of this research. I've never worked on spiders, but kind of without having to learn, even kind of doing a sort of more sensible route based on just looking at a sort of experimental setup. So really remarkable cognitive stuff in jumping spiders. We've never applied our criteria to them, and I've never worked on them, so I'm not really the person to ask. I think there may be an example of an animal where they do badly in a way in this conversation because the cognition experiments in them are sort of too clever. Our criteria were designed to look for evidence for sentience in animals that haven't really been studied in the context of sentience. So things like kind of motivational trade-offs or types of associative learning might well have been studied for other reasons. But we included them in our criteria because we wanted to sort of survey the literature even for invertebrates that hadn't been well studied in the context of sentience. We didn't include things like really complex route planning or some of the amazing kind of behaviors and web building and so on that spiders display. And so I think in a way that's hurt them, but I do have some colleagues who are very interested in potentially the kind of model-based behavior of these spiders, which could indicate consciousness. It's not really my area at all, but there are some remarkable behaviors for sure.
Yeah, I remind of a sentence written in Jonathan Birch's book, which was like, sentience is not intelligence. So if you see like intelligence like behavior, doesn't necessarily mean it's sentient, but for sure it makes things easier in terms of designing protocols and asking this type of question.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
So we have a question from Justine. Thank a lot for your presentation. Is it possible to study sentience with a phylogenetic question? When did it appear, and what species could be theoretically be sentient?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and it's one that I spent a very long time pondering. And I think maybe if I sort of had a genie saying, I'll tell you the sort of true answer to anything you like. I wouldn't sort of pick who sort of shot Kennedy or anything. I would pick which animals are sentient in the phylogeny. Did sentience arise only once and sort of maybe all of the descendants have it unless they've lost it, or did it arise kind of multiple times in different ways? My personal view is that we simply don't have the evidence across a broad enough range of taxa to really be able to make that case. There are those who sort of suggest that it seems like sentience evolved 3 times, once in the kind of vertebrates, once in the arthropods, so the decapods and the insects, and then once in the kind of cephalopods. I personally don't think there's been enough work on the sort of intermediate species to say whether that's kind of 3 convergent points. And I don't think we necessarily even have strong enough evidence for sentience in those animals to say, yes, they are likely enough to be sentient that we can kind of make that conclusion. So it's a fantastic question. I don't think it's one that the science can answer, and I think that will probably be the case for the time being. But I'm also very interested in it. So if anyone has a sort of good idea on how to test this, I would be very very happy to listen.
Yeah, I think also maybe because we are studying sentience with indicators, maybe in some species we can find indicators, but not the other, and vice versa. So maybe some species could have like fragments of sentience, but not necessarily the whole package.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then we have a long question by Abby, which is fragmented in 5 questions. So Abby say, you mentioned applying regulation based on published data from relative species. Will this not end up moving the goalpost? How can we go about deciding how relative a species needs to be? Would this be based on phylogeny? In this case, what about the ecological and environmental context these species are in, which may drive them to show or not show some of the criteria?
Yeah, fantastic question. I mean, the answer truthfully is that it's a judgment call and there's no right or wrong answer. I think we need some level of generalization because otherwise, say, for example, the vast majority of mammals wouldn't be protected because no research has been done on them. The flip side of that is that if you kind of generalize from, say, a chimpanzee to a slime mold, clearly that's going too far in the generalization. So then, like I said, I think you have to sort of say, well, where do we sort of balance those competing demands? Jonathan, who I've worked with in our work, Birch, who Catherine mentioned, sort of suggests working to the order, which is kind of a taxonomic group, obviously. I think that's probably a fair generalization, but of course, you know, the order really varies in evolutionary distance depending on which group of animals you're talking about. So it's a fairly arbitrary line. And I think you're always going to have that kind of arbitrary line to have some degree of generalization. So it's a fantastic question. I would sort of broadly work to the order, but what I hope is that in the future, rather than having to take fairly arbitrary taxonomic categories and say, we're just going to generalize within this, if we can look for these kind of traits and these criteria across a broad enough range of species and hopefully see where they're present, not present, we can start to take a more sensible kind of phylogenetic approach and say, okay, it might actually be that a really distant animal from this one displays it, but if multiple animals that are sort of equally distantly related, we can sort of infer that potentially that animal is. That's, I guess, the answer to the first part, but I don't think we're there yet, so I don't think we have enough evidence across different species. The second part, what about differences in ecology and so on? Again, really good question and really tough one, because, for example, most of the cognition work in bees has been done on kind of social bees. What about solitary ones? There's been a lot less work done there. And again, I just don't think we know. I would love to see more cognition work, and I think this is sort of starting to be a trend, more cognition work in less well-studied species to start to address that. But for now, we don't really know. So I think, again, it's not perfect, but I think we have to sort of, given the ethical imperative of studying sentience, I think we have to sort of make best guesses, be honest about the uncertainty, but kind of make these kind of trade-offs. Catherine, I don't know whether you have thoughts there.
Yeah, you have to make the balance between how much you generalize and possibly say that this insect is sentient when it's not, but also how much you protect these animals, right? So we have the last question from the chat by Natasha. Thanks for the talk. What do you mean by humane pesticide?
Yeah, great question. So generally speaking, in kind of humane slaughter circles in animal welfare science, a humane death is defined as a death where the pain lasts for less than a second. So if we're talking about, hopefully I said more humane pesticide, we might think about a pesticide that acts quicker. So rather than taking several days, it only takes a day or less than a day. I think it's unlikely that we'll find one that kills everything instantly, that isn't pretty environmentally damaging, but one that acts quicker, I think certainly could save an awful lot of suffering that way. You could also think about insecticides that act on parts of the insects that, for example, don't have nociceptors. They might be more likely to lead to a painless death. So I think there are sort of various potential avenues you can go down. Again, there's not really any of this research going on currently, but my personal view is that this would be a really important area for people to go into.
So we have 2 minutes left and no question in the chat, so I guess I can finally ask one of my tons of questions. So yeah, as you said, you work on bumblebees and I worked on honeybees, and we are assessing indicators of consciousness in individuals, right? Which, like, of course, it has advantages because you can control more the protocol and you have less bias. But it's also important to consider that, as you said, these animals are social and they live in colonies. So do you think the next step would be to study if they can communicate these subjective feelings For example, like emotional contagion or empathy, which is something I would love to study.
Yeah, I actually think that in bumblebees, I know less about honeybees, although broadly similar. I think in bumblebees, there's potentially some really remarkable forms of communications that they're displaying. There was some work that happened at the University of Guelph, which I don't think was published or was, but it was a PhD thesis about 10 years ago, looking at the idea was that bees could sort of learn a task, individual bees, and then if they went back into the colony and you got sort of another bee out, that bee could actually perform the task much quicker. Which is incredible. Like, how on earth was that communication potentially, if those results could be replicated, how on earth was that communication happening? I don't think we know the answer to that, but I absolutely agree. I think there's aspects of social cognition. I mean, social cognition is reasonably well studied in bees, obviously, but I think there's aspects of it that are far more remarkable than we realize. I'm not sure how relevant that is to sentience. I mean, you mentioned emotional contagion. Just the idea of sort of emotion sort of passing between individuals. I think that would be an interesting sort of area to explore in bees, that I can certainly imagine it. It's a very difficult thing to study, even in kind of vertebrates. So it'd be a tough one to study. But yeah, I think that I think there's much more to know about social behavior and social learning in bees than even we do already.
Great. So sadly we have one last question in the chat, but we have to wrap up because we have a Meet the PI session. So Luke, I encourage you to write a question in the Discord channel for Andrew, so he can check it and answer you. And yeah, Andrew, I want to thank you for this presentation. And also I wanted to say that as someone that doesn't have a lot of background on philosophy, and it can be difficult to dive into it when you're a scientist, I want to say that I think the community really appreciate the way you made your talk really accessible, and you show a lot of data to discuss about. So yeah, thank you for this great presentation, and yeah, have a good day.
Thank you. You too.